Next week, we want to talk about the glory of the Lord. I want to deal with a verse that I really don't know where to fit it in, so I'm going to fit it in at the very beginning, and then we'll get into our passage. But it's a verse that I feel that we need to deal with. We're in chapter 2, verse 25. It's a verse that causes problems sometimes from people from time to time. So it's a difficult verse sometimes. So let's deal with it first. 1 Samuel 2:25. I'll give you just a moment. And then we'll spend the rest of our time on Samuel and this little light of mine, but I want to work this in. (2:25). If any man sins against another, God will mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? But they would not listen to the voice of their fathers, for the Lord desired to put them to death. All right, so let's talk about this. The Lord desired to put them to death. Now this more likely did not happen with one sin event. The Bible said that they lay with the women at the gate of the tabernacle. In other words, it was an ongoing immoral sin. And they stole meat from the altar that was to be offered to God or to the people. And it was an ongoing process. So God did not come to this decision in a moment of time. He desired to put them to death. And once he desired to put them to death, there was no hope. In fact, we're going to talk about this now with this same idea. Let's deal with another verse in 1 John chapter 5. Way back in the back of the Bible, just before Revelation, we'll see the exact same thing, just expressed a little different. 1 John chapter 5, verse 16. Just before Revelation, 1 John chapter 5, another difficult verse. Let's put them together. If anyone sees his brother committing a sin not leading to death, he shall ask, and God will for him give life to those who have committed sin not leading to death. There is a sin leading to death. I do not say that he should make request for this. So God says there is a sin that leads to death, and when a person commits this, he says, I don't want you praying for him because it's not going to do any good. Now, people will say, well, what is the sin unto death? Now look closely, because this is important. It says there is a sin leading to death, not the sin. So it's not one particular sin. It is a sin that a person has committed over and over again. It comes to the point that God says, you have pushed my wrath button. And from this point on, there's no point praying, because I am not going to hear the prayers. these two sons of Levi had committed a sin unto death. Now, we say, or we ask the question, well, how does a person know when they've committed a sin unto death? They know within their heart that they have come to that place. God gives that person a clear warning, but he says, God, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and you're not going to stop me. So they know that they have committed a sin unto death. They might not know it's a sin unto death, but they know that they have pushed God's wrath button and that they're in trouble. Now, who else knows that this sin unto death has been committed? People who are associated with them, because he said, I don't want you praying for him. Well, if he doesn't reveal it to somebody, they wouldn't know not to pray for it. It's usually something that we can't run around talking about, but I remember one day the Lord made it very clear to me that a person had committed the sin unto death. I had personally warned them. Others had warned them. And then one day God just clearly spoke to my heart. He said, don't pray for them anymore. Now, let's take the city of Nineveh. In the book of Jonah, the Bible said it was an exceedingly wicked city. Did the people of Nineveh commit the sin unto death? If you remember, Jonah went and preached. The people repented. And God held back his wrath because he said he was going to destroy it. He held his wrath back for 70 years. 70 years later, God did destroy Nineveh. So, we don't know how far it takes to push God's wrath button, but we do know we better not be seeing how close we can get to it without pushing it. So these two boys, God had said, I have determined, I have desired to put them to death. So nothing was going to turn it around. The fear of God keeps us from evil. Now, notice in 1 John it says, if any brother, all right, so people say, well, only a lost person commit the sin unto death. Does the scriptures agree to that? No. He's talking about a Christian brother. That's the way the verse starts out that way. It's Christians who commit the sin unto death. These two boys are followers of God. They are the priests in the tabernacle. So sometimes we try to get Christians off the hook just because they've been born again. Sometimes people say, well, a Christian, if he's a Christian, he can't do this. Almost any sin that a person can commit, we find that a Christian commits that in the Bible and in life today. We just had one of the giants of the Christian faith this week make a great, we heard about his great failure. Now, I'm not saying that's a sin unto death. What I'm saying is a Christian can commit a vile, vile sin, but yet still be a child of God. Now, I just wanted to say that because I didn't know how to fit it in, and I hope you understand in putting these two verses together. Let me add one other thing to this. Let's go to Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 14. Now, you got Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then Ezekiel. It's long on about the middle of the Bible, and we'll throw out one more thing that may help us. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Ezekiel 14, and it mentions three of the great giants in God's family. Ezekiel 14, verse 12. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, if a country sin against me by committing unfaithfulness, and I stretch out my hand against it, destroying its supply of bread, send famine against it, or cut off from it both man and beast, even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, by their own righteousness they could only deliver themselves, declared the Lord. So God is saying here, people can come to the point where they have pushed my wrath button. That's my paraphrasing it. He said, if you had Noah, Daniel, and Job praying for you, that I wouldn't even listen to them. Now, it's almost said the exact same thing. We won't turn to it, but in Jeremiah chapter 15, verse 1, it says, if you had Moses and Samuel praying for you, I wouldn't listen to them. So here we go. Noah, Daniel, Job, Moses, and Samuel. So God really means it when he says, if a person commits a sin unto death, there's no point praying for them. So we need to warn people, you need to repent. We can't make them repent, but we need to warn them. And I think if the truth is known, I think there is a lot of people that's walking the face of the earth today that they have committed the sin unto death. And it's horrible. There's nothing we can do about it. All right, now let's get into our passage for today. This little light of mine. Chapter 3, verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord before Eli, and the word from the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent. Now what happens is that when we come to the place in life where the word of the Lord is infrequent, there's no visions, there's no blessings upon God, it is one of the most critical, dangerous periods that we can be in, but we got to admit it, we go into those periods. What we say is, well, God is not moving. We have got to do something to get things moving in the right direction. Let's take a couple of illustrations. When Abraham was 75 years old, God said that he would give him a son. In fact, he said even more than that. He said, you will be the father of many nations. So he's 75 years old. It's kind of late in life to start producing nations. So 10 years went by, No children at all. So Abraham says, Lord, you're not moving. You're not doing anything. So Abraham and his wife said, well, we're going to have to do something about this ourselves. And along came Ishmael. 13 years passed. Ishmael is a teenage boy. And God comes back to Abraham and said, Abraham, I'm going to give you a son. I promised it to you 24 years ago. Next year, you're going to have a son. We're going to jump forward in the life of Saul. Saul is at the end of his life. He has been fighting the Philistines ever since he's been king. And now he's got the biggest battle of his life. He does not have David. In fact, David has gone to live with the Philistines. And we'll see it as we move through these stories of Samuel and David. But the women sang a song after David killed Goliath. They said, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. So he's at this point, he would give anything possible if he had David on his side. He does not. Samuel is dead. And God is not making himself known to Saul. It is a day when the word from the Lord was rare and the visions were infrequent. He hadn't heard from the Lord for a long time. And so in chapter 28, this is the part that I'm referring to. I'm going to read a couple of verses. We'll get to it later. We'll preach on this later when we get to it. But it's a dark day in his life. And verse 5 says, of chapter 28, he was afraid, his heart greatly trembled. God was not there. And then in verse 6 of chapter 28, it says, when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him. So he said, I got to do something. I've called on the Lord won't help me. I don't have Samuel to give me advice. I don't have David to fight for me. I got to do something. He went to a witch. And he made things worse. Now, let's give a third example. The church is dying. The numbers have dropped off. The money has dropped off. Everything is going bad. No matter what we do, God doesn't seem to bless. So a church says, well, we've got to do something. And so they start activating things that is not part of God's program. God's program is very simple. We do the four things that God asks us to do. We do them with joy and gladness, and then we wait upon the Lord. You see, in a time of crisis, we want to give God a timetable. God, you've got to do this by this time. And if you don't, we're going to do something. We cannot get into that trap, or any church can do this. So this is the danger of we're in a dark time. Now, Or we're going to change our programs? Not if I can help it. We're going to keep doing what God asked us to do. We're going to worship the Lord with gladness. We're going to pray. We're going to believe. We're going to love God. We're going to love one another. And we're going to have Christian commitment to each other, to God, and to fellowship. And God says, in my timing, I will do what I intend to do. But we're not going to add things that will make it more complicated. If it's left up to me, that is. All right. Now, what causes these periods of times when the word from the Lord is rare? Well, it's easy to say sin, and that pretty well covers a lot of it. Most of the time, we get into the trouble that we get into trouble because we have turned our back on the Lord and the ways of the Lord. But that's not always the case. The Bible tells us in Job chapter 1 that he was a very righteous man. But what happened to him? He lost his wealth. He lost his children. His wife turned against him. And he lost his health. But he was a very righteous man. So, the word of the Lord was very rare in Job's day. He would give anything if God would just explain to him what's happening. He doesn't know what's happening. He can't get a handle on it. But he says, is it right to accept blessings? I'm just paraphrasing. Is it right to accept blessings and goodness from the Lord and never to accept trouble from the Lord? He says, the Lord gives, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. All right. So we see that this is the situation that Samuel is living in. It says, Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli. Now let's keep him at order. He ministered to the Lord by ministering to Eli. Now let's look at, let's go back to chapter 2, verse 22. Chapter 2, 1 Samuel, chapter 2, verse 22. And Eli was very old. That's all we're going to read. Now let's read verse 29. Why do you kick at my sacrifice and at my offering, which I have commanded in my dwellings, and honor your sons above me by making yourself fat? All right, so we see that Eli is old, and we see that he is fat. Now, let's go to chapter 3, verse 2. And it happened at that time, as Eli was lying down in his place, now his eyelids began to grow dim, and he could not see well. Eli is old, fat, and nearly blind. Samuel ministered unto the Lord by ministering to Eli. Now, Samuel could not do the work of a priest. His mother had made him a little ephod to wear, but it was not an official one. Does anybody know how old you had to be a priest? You had to be 30. Samuel was a little boy. 5, 6, 7, somewhere in that neighborhood. I don't know how old he was, but somewhere in that neighborhood. Now, if he's old, nearly blind, and fat, he needs a caregiver, right? He needs somebody to help him put his sandals on and help him get his sandals off. He needs somebody to help him dress. It doesn't say here, but he probably had a bedpan at night. Samuel was ministering to the Lord by ministering to Eli. You see, sometimes we want to say, I'd like to do the work of God. I wish God would make me let's just say Billy Graham, or make me a great missionary. We need to see that ministering to Eli is ministering to the Lord. Those jobs that nobody wants and no one feels that there's no recognition to it. How do we do the mundane work of the Lord? We do it unto the Lord. We minister unto the Lord. Let me read this verse to you. I'll read it slow. We won't turn there, but it's Colossians 3:23. If you want to jot that down, look at it later. Colossians 3:23. Whatever you do, do your work heartily, as from the Lord rather than from men. Whatever you do, if it's a bedpan, if it's putting on sandals, if it's bringing a dish of food, and you can fill in the blanks. Whatever you do it heartily unto the Lord rather than for man. All right. Excuse me. Okay, let's just make up an example. Let's say my job is to clean the toilets. Time after time after time, I do my job. And if I'm not doing it unto the Lord, I will say, nobody appreciates me. No one ever thanks me. I'm getting tired of this. Why doesn't somebody else come along and help me? You see, whatever I do, if I do not do it unto the Lord, it has a tendency to create bitterness and resentment on my part. So no matter what it is, how big it is, how small it is, how much responsibility I have, I'm doing it unto the Lord with all my heart. I do it unto the Lord. Therefore, if that is my focus, then where I get thanked, where I get cursed, where I get complaints, I'm doing it to the Lord, and I can let these things bounce off of me. Now, and to save time, I'm going to give you another one. It's Ecclesiastes 9:10, and I think this is in the bulletin. Whatever your hand finds to do, verily do it with all your might. Now, the emphasis I want to put on here is that whatever your hand finds to do. In other words, don't wait for somebody to find you and me a job. You find it and do it. And be creative about it and enthusiastic about it. That's what it's saying. There is no verse in the Bible that God honors bench warmers. That is not one of the gifts in the Bible. Psalms 110, verse 3. In the day of thy power, the people will volunteer freely. Right. So, when God is moving, you don't have to beg people. You just say, what can I do? Or I will find something to do that no one is doing. We all know how to pass the job. You're sitting around the table and we say, this needs to be done. And you know what happens most of the time? Rather than somebody, well, I'll do it. Well, they say, well, John here, he can do that. But never me volunteer. I pass the job on to someone else. A happy Christian is one who is voluntarily doing the work of God and doing it unto the Lord. In Matthew 25, verse 40, it says, to the extent that you did this to one of these brothers of mine, you did it even unto me. And this is at a judgment of the sheep and the goat. Jesus said, I will allow you into my kingdom because when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And when I was naked, and you clothed me. And they said to Jesus, well, Jesus, we never saw you hungry. We never saw you thirsty. We never saw you naked. And he says, as you do it unto my brethren, you've done it unto me. He that is greatest is the servant of all. Zechariah 4:10 says, despise not the day of small things. Somehow or another, we want to despise the little things. Now, Samuel only had a little light. He was just a little boy, but he had a light, and he was using it for God. Matthew 10:42 says, if you give a cup of cold water, I will give you a reward. That's not despising the day of small things. So, the first thing we've seen here, we've seen that Samuel was ministering unto the Lord by ministering to Eli. Now, the next thing I want us to look at is in verse 7. Samuel did not know the Lord, nor had the Lord yet been revealed to him. Chapter 3, verse 7. Samuel didn't know the Lord. Well, we're not through. Go to chapter 2, verse 11. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They didn't know the Lord. So you got two priests that don't know the Lord, and you got a little boy that don't know the Lord. Now, the word know there does not mean that they are not children of God. It does not mean that they are not believers. The word know there means they know him a little. Let's make up an illustration. There's Jimmy John sitting back here. I'm just making this up. And somebody asked me, do you know Jimmy? Well, I know him a little bit. You see? And then somebody said, well, do you know Skip? Oh, yeah, I know Skip real well. I know them both. I just know one more than I know the other. So when it says Samuel didn't know the Lord, he had a small amount of knowledge of God, but he had it. Eli's son are grown men. They're over the age of 30. They know the Lord, but they know him a little bit. The difference is Samuel is moving forward and he is growing in his relationship with God. These boys have come to a standstill. They're going back, and God says, I'm going to wipe them out. And no one is going to stop me, no matter how hard they pray. In this story, Samuel is laying down not far from Eli, because this is where I'm using the phrase bedpan. He hears a voice, and Samuel jumps up and he runs to Eli and he said, did you call me? Because I assume this was probably a regular nightly chore. Bedpan time is what I'm saying. So he was accustomed to this. Now, I don't know why his boys don't take care of him. It doesn't say, but Eli is doing this. Now, it says that the sons of Eli were worthless. They knew the Lord, but they were worthless. And somebody occasionally will say, well, I don't think there's such thing as a worthless Christian. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, it's worthless. So they are worthless followers of Christ, and I don't know how much emphasis I would put on followers. So Samuel didn't know the Lord, but his little light was shining. He did what he was called to do and what he could do, and he is growing. Now, are we going to fail? Samuel did not know when God spoke to him. He spoke to him 3 different times. And on the 3rd time, Eli said to him, he said, Lord, speak to me. I'm listening. The first 2 times, Eli did not know it was God speaking. Samuel did not know it was God speaking, but Eli finally caught on to it. But the first 3 times, Samuel failed. He didn't recognize the voice of God. So what's the application here? Can we fail? You better be. Yeah, and we fall all the time. You remember Peter? He turned his back on Jesus when he was being crucified. You remember that story? He failed. But he kept on moving. And who preached the great sermon at Pentecost? It was the man who had failed 40 days or 50 days before. So what am I saying? Assume that in your service to God, you're going to fail. And second, assume that other people who are serving God, they're going to fail, and accept them in their failure. That's the way it works. Now wow. It's 11 o'clock. What am I going to do? I'm only halfway through. We'll try to finish this next week.